session, we have a new theme, which is accompaniment of children involved in violence. And so this is fundamental elements which concern restorative justice, the role of the offender, the victim, and the community in the trial. So basically, it is to take into account the needs of the victim as well as the needs of a community. It is absolutely very interesting to be able to use restorative justice with children in order to give them some elements, also impose limits. And this is a little bit the goal of our role today. Another theme which is important for those who are under justice is those who commit sexual crime. So we're going to have guidelines targeted for this specific type of crime. And for the last session, we will identify a number of activities to raise awareness among young. And I'm going to present the new handbook on the Bureau between the two entities, restorative justice and the other. We have the chance of having Bruno van der Maat, who is going to take the floor. Our session today is, as I said, the fundamental aspects concerning restorative justice and the offender, the victim, and the community in the trial. He's an ecologist, he's a theologian, and he's been main professor, and he's a professor at the University Santa Maria de Arequipa in Peru, where he has done his PhD. He is also a member of the International Society of Criminology and of the academic system of the United Nations. In particular, he has a formation, an ongoing formation in restorative justice from Geneva, the University of Geneva. He has, he's the author of a number of articles on new forms of justice in Spanish. So this is from an academic point of view. He's also a practitioner. He's the member of an association in Peru and also volunteer in prisons and in homes in different countries. He's also member of the board of the International Bureau, BICE. So once again, take your time and the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Marie-Laure. Good morning, good afternoon. I don't really know what is your time zone. Thank you very much to allow me to share some of the fundamental aspects concerning restorative justice with a special focus on juvenile restorative justice. I'm very happy to see that I recognize a number of photos and faces from Europe and Latin America, but I'm particularly pleased to have this opportunity of sharing with you this experience because this is the module where there are a number of presentations, and I noticed that the audience is of high quality with competence and skills. So we're not going to simply speak about theoretical principles, but we're going to be able to compare them in your practices. I would say that there is an additional advantage and plus value that we do have many differences. I don't really know exactly which is the situation in your countries. I believe it certainly varies from Latin America and also Europe and other continents. We certainly do have very much different cultural, judicial, social systems, the role of families, the role of the society at large. Certainly all of this influences. And so I will inevitably have to provide sort of general purpose principles, and maybe you will try to adopt them and adjust them to your realities in your context. An initial question that I would like to ask, why should we actually speak about young people, juveniles who come in contact with the law? Probably there is something which is not working properly in our legal systems and our justice systems. I'm not necessarily targeting one given system, because we know that judicial systems often come into play when there is a situation of injustice. So we can also say that laws are not always well done, but laws, we do have a corpus of, so a large body of laws, but they're not always necessarily well conceived and well thought of. We do have a body of laws, but we also have to see how they are interpreted. How are the judges, the judicial institutions apply them? I'm thinking about Peru. Peru has been one of the first countries who have signed the Convention for Children's Rights, but once the convention has been signed, we have changed the code of childhood, and let's say that judges somehow had adopted the language of the convention, but they somehow remain a bit focused with their ideas, which were the ideas and the concepts prior to the convention. So we have to we have to produce a change in the vocabulary and the mindset. And this is inevitably reflected also in the audience and the public, because in general, there is a very negative approach of public opinion towards offenders, and even if the offender is a juvenile, so they're happy to see them behind the bars. Now, of course, we can have good laws, but if we don't have any resources to implement them and to put them into force, enter them into force, it can be actually, it can produce the opposite result. Instead of being justice, it can turn into injustice. We also have an abusive application of pre-trial imprisonment, because we believe that that's the best solution, and then we see, it's like saying we will see what we will do afterwards, so the preventive measures. So I think that often our systems of juvenile justice has ended up by creating injustice rather. I would say that in the end, there is also a form of contradiction and contrast, because our judicial systems believe that there is an agreement between the offender and society, so that you have made a mistake or a mischief, we cannot pardon you, we will apply some socio-educational measures, and once you have finished and you have fulfilled, you return and you are reinserted in society, and everything returns to normality. But this contract underwritten with the young is never actually implemented, because once he leaves the institution, he's no longer accepted maybe in his family, he has dropped out, he's a dropout from school, he has lost a job, and he also has a stigma which remains with him throughout his entire life. So that debt, which has been actually somehow paid to some extent, because he has purged his pain, and it remains. So he has finally served his sentence. I believe that for a number, it's not only a problem limited to a number of countries. I would say that it's more of a general problem. So maybe in order to avoid having to see me all the time, I thought that maybe I thought I would prepare a PowerPoint, and I was thinking maybe it would be nice to use some drawings, and also the limited part of text is available in 3 languages, and you have them in the 3 colors. So English is red, green is French, blue, Spanish. There's no reason for those colors. There's no specific reason. I was just wondering if this has to do with some problems. And as I said, it's no, not at all. It belongs, it's common to all the countries. So as you know, at the end of 2019, there has been a global study published by the United Nations on children deprived of liberty. That's the author Novak. He's a professor expert, UN expert, independent, and he was chairing a team, which was an independent team. And for the very first time, they tried to analyze the situation of children deprived of liberty worldwide. It's not only children behind the bars, but also children who are in prison with their parents, children who are in a psychiatric institution, or in refugee camps. It's over 5 million children. So those behind the bars are around 400,000. But it doesn't include the 1.8 million in the police offices. So I would say that we could speak about a total of over 2 million deprived of liberty for juvenile justice, involved in juvenile justice. So it's a very large amount. And this brings about a question, first of all. A prison for a child, is that the last resort? Is it actually the last resort, as the convention stipulates, or rather an easy choice? By far, it is not the last resort. And so we have to ask, what impact does this have on minors? You can actually access the global study. This is the link. It's over 100 pages. Maybe you don't have to read it in a blow, but you can read it because it is interesting. And now, if we have a look at the situation which is presented by this global study, what Manfred Novak tells us, when you're deprived of liberty, you are deprived of your childhood. So you are deprived of that fundamental moment of development in the life of a person. Some could say, yes, but if a minor has done something bad, we have to set limits, and then we have to maybe put him into prison, and then when he is back into society, he is acting well. This is one of the theories of restoration. There's another one which is called labeling. Once the person enters into a judicial system, he is labeled. He has like a stigma. So he's also traumatized, and that is certainly not the best solution. Between the two, that of let's say rehabilitation and labeling, which is the actual one? It's not easy. It is not easy to be defined, because in the light of the studies, we could say that the two are difficult, because it's not easy to actually analyze the minors under, let's say, judicial system, but we cannot provide the same quality. There are some psychological and differences, family differences, and even if they don't live in the same neighborhood, in the two families, the situation is different, varies. So we don't really have a group which could be used to monitor the situation. However, there's another study which also dates back to 2019, but which I think is, from a methodological point of view, it is fairly valid. It is in English. It's a group of English researchers, and they try to see how can we find best way. I think that they would deserve a Nobel Prize. And they said, let's use actually some twins. So they have chosen they have chosen a large amount of twins. They belong to the same family, same brothers, same neighborhood, same education. So I would say that it's a wonderful monitoring group. So they have done the follow-up. So it's about couples of twins, over 1,000. So one had been in contact with law, which means that he had spent at least one night in a police office, or at least he had some kind of judicial file. So then the other twin had no contact. So they have done a bit of a follow-up of the situation, and they tried to see what was the reaction. The possibility of having other conflicts with the law was certainly higher in the group of those twins who had an initial, let's say, file or record with the police than the others. So I would say that probably the labeling is the most likely to be true, because once the young person enters into contact with the law, it is likely that it will occur a second time. I think this team and this study is very interesting. It's slightly technical, but I would say that the conclusions are of great interest. Now, of course, I would even add by saying that this contact with justice, with police or the judge or other, is something which is certainly absolutely negative for the child. So it's actually, depriving him of his social development in a society. So it's almost like he is handicapped. He is handicapped from the disabled to some extent. He's suffering from this handicap at start in his life. So in a number of recommendations, it's number 7 that I would like to refer here in the study, where you can see states should prioritize restorative justice, diversion of judicial procedures, and solutions that don't deprive of liberty. So these 3 recommendations are interconnected, because in restorative justice, the goal, let's say that from a technical point of view, we try to create a suspension, interrupt the judicial procedure, avoid that he has a criminal record, avoid that there is hearing in the court. And of course, this is one of those solutions which do not deprive of liberties. So restorative justice, diversion of judicial procedures, and solutions that don't deprive of liberty are interconnected. And this is one of the recommendations that you can find in the global study above mentioned. Now, of course, one could ask, what is this restorative justice? We are going to try to clarify this in our first session. Maybe I want to speak about practices, because it's not a question of justice. It's more of something that we actually do without knowing. So we have a family, we have a given family. You see in this drawing on the left-hand side, the parents, maybe the grandmother, and then the children. And what happens when a child, does something incorrect? Well, some would say out, and we don't know what, we don't want to hear from you. It's simply a punishment, sorry. It's a punishment, and for some, make their life easy. One, punishes the child by saying you're not going to have a dessert during a week, you're not going to play soccer for a week, or this is not really the solution. Normally in a family, okay, what you have done is not good. We're going to find a solution. What would you suggest? What would you propose? And of course, so you cannot simply give a punishment, because a punishment doesn't really lead to much of a solution. There are a lot of psychologists who acknowledge that it's useless to punish for the sake of punishing. Psychoanalyst you told us and affirms that if you hit a boy, if he has, for example, crossed the street without looking, well, that's an instinct of a parent in a form of self-defense, because he got scared in seeing the child crossing the road. He basically, with a little blow, he tries to sort of overcome his fear. But once you have done that, the child will not understand. He will not understand why he cannot cross the street, but he starts to be afraid. He's going to be afraid of the person who has hit him, and also who has slapped him, and also will not understand how he has to cross the road. I remember that when I used to be in my primary school, you know, first grade, and we were all invited to be very attentive in crossing the street. What did the professor tell us, the teachers? You know, what you have to do, you have to look left, to look right, but a little child doesn't know what is left and right, at least when he's very young. So he said, if you have a watch, okay, I just tell you that the watch is on your left-hand side. So look first where on the side of your watch, and then on the other side. And if there's no one coming, then you can cross the street. So there was no punishment. That was the explanation. He was actually instructing his students. Now, in the image that you see here on the right, he has broken the glass or the window of his own family or of his neighbors. So he's not going to play football. Maybe he might be a new champion like Messi or Ronaldo. So what are we going to do? Well, maybe you're going to pay the window glass. No, I don't think a child has that possibility. He can repair his mischief in another thing. Maybe he could contribute to working at the gardening with his neighbor, or maybe help in the house, do some little housework. So you could repair and remedy to this mischief without simply being punished, because the punishment is not going to solve the problem as such. Now, these, let's say, are these solutions, restorative solutions, limited to family? And no, it can happen also in completely other settings. Now, for, let's say, decades, there are so-called library circles. What are these library circles? You have the director of a library and someone who goes against a rule or a norm. Let's say a child has lost a book. He has taken, and he doesn't have the money to pay. So either you exclude him from the library, saying if you don't return this book to the library, you will no longer be able to access and to enter into the library, which that necessarily would limit his cultural development, because if he comes to the library, is that because he probably doesn't have enough books at home to read or to consult, or we actually accept him in a library circle. First of all, you ask him, do you rise the what does that represent? So maybe what could you do in alternative? Help, you know, do a little job in the library to somehow compensate the loss of the book, and raise awareness, allow him to be aware of what he has done, be aware of his gesture, and that he can somehow compensate for that. Now, for about 10 years, these library circles exist in the United States and in other institutions. They exist also in schools, in other institutions. These let's say, restorative circles exist. Is it something new? No, as Marie-Laure was saying, in the light of the researches that I have carried out, I have found the same even back 4,000 years ago in the Mesopotamic civilizations. If you read a book on restorative justice, you certainly have noticed that the origin of this justice maybe has been comes from Canada, the indigenous populations, or the Maori back in Oceania. But in our culture, we basically can find the same dynamics. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a practice which is still a traditional practice, which is the word. When there is a problem in a community, you gather the entire community, and those who have been involved in the situation, in the conflict, are called to explain the situation, and the whole village or community can take the floor. Not only the leader of that community or of that village, everyone can take the floor, and all together, they try to reach a solution, so to solve the problem. So both the offender and the offended, because the community is involved in this problem. It's like a problem solving. This procedure might last even a couple of days, but it ends up in a solution. So this is actually rooted in certain cultures. I haven't found examples for Eastern Europe, but in Latin America, in the Andes, we do have a given process, which is a traditional one, which is a problem-solving process. In all of the countries, there are a number of, feasts and traditions during which you drink and dance. Sometimes when you drink, you might drink a little too much, which ends up in little clashes and little riots and little conflicts. And it can happen, it can even turn into a casualty sometimes when it turns to a violent one. But what is the classical reaction in the Western culture? Everyone has seen who is the murderer. He is handed to the police office, or who is going to basically hand it on to the prosecutor. The prosecutor is going to condemn with a sentence, for example, a 20 years sentence. Now, if you send this man into a prison during 20 years, he certainly will experience problems in the prison, but somebody might say, but this is his problem, not mine. And also his family will be suffering because he's no longer working, so they have lost maybe the breadwinner, and also the family of the person murdered will remain without the breadwinners. So what are we going to say? You're not going to go to prison, and you're going to work the two lands, your land, the land of your family who has to continue to survive, and the land of the person that you have murdered, up until the children become self-sufficient. So this is the punishment or the reparation, the way you can restore justice to your mischief. He's not certainly going to marry the widow. He's not going to be able to replace neither the father nor the husband, but he's going to try to make sure that life in that family continues. At least they will be able to survive. It's really a very old-dated tradition, and which certainly eliminates the fact of being sent to prison. It's not the classical solution found in or used rather in our Western countries, where we tend to instead use prisons. How did we, let's say, how did we reach this kind of solution? Now, this is a bit of a fight between the two. It can end up in two different possibilities. So maybe one of the two can be hurt. It's basically a fight between two. What is the normal reaction? Legally speaking, that's what you find on the right-hand side. This kind of fight will probably evolve, and the outcome will be between two families, because the victim will probably want to revenge. So he will go back home and will say, now we are going to revenge this. So there's going to be a reaction. So this is a bit of an escalation. A spiral of violence is going to escalate rapidly. So what starts with simply, I have stolen an egg, then you will steal my chick, and then my hen, and then my, it's going to be an escalation, which is going to be triggered. At the end, the two families, two clans, two groups, two ethnical groups are going to pursue this revengeance. And at the end, they don't even remember what was the triggering reason. The only thing they know is that the other is their enemy. And this really leads to an ongoing vicious circle, which is simply pure chaos. Well, this is Talion. Talion comes back from the Roman era, the Roman Empire. So you have okay, you have a judge, and in the middle, there has been actually mischief, and there are some Hammurabi is the central monument that you see in this image, where it's not the oldest, which contains laws engraved, such as the Italian, according to which, so if you cut, for example, okay, if you have broken an arm, you have a right to break the arm of the other. He has cut the ear, you have the right to cut his ear. It's a very old law, but this somehow limits revenge. So basically, you have suffered something and you can do exactly the same. So it's basically, it has a very old principle, as I said, eye for eye, arm for arm. It's a law of retaliation, but you limit this retaliation, and it doesn't escalate. But it's true in theory, because in practice it's not always easy. Because I mean, imagine if you eye for eye, no? For example, imagine what happens, that the other dies because he maybe remains only with one eye. So if I have still one, but if I do eye for eye and he has only one eye, the other, he remains blind. So we are not on the same level. And the Hammurabi Code tells us that if an architect builds a house and which is badly built, and the roof falls down on one of the children who die, well, the owner has the right of killing the child of the architect's child. So one eye for eye. But if the architect, maybe the architect has only one son, so he's killing the only child, while maybe this family has 10 children and only one died. So if the Italian was, in a way, a form of punishment, but it wasn't ideal, because even in the Hammurabi Code has actually found an alternative solution. That is to replace that. We replace that with some money, instead of eye for eye. So there are a given number of formulas and solutions so that you can actually reimburse, or you do that with money. So you don't do that physically, imposing a physical punishment. Actually, the victim sometimes doesn't have enough maybe money to pay. That's also true. That could be a problem. There is a photo of the National Museum in Stockholm, which shows during the Vikings, you have the price of a free man. It's 4 kilos of gold. In the middle, you have the price to be a free man, free man who is a foreigner is half the size, and top is the price of a slave. So according to the offender, the price can vary. It depends if you're a foreigner, a slave, or a free man. So the revenge is basically interrupted because the compensation is done with the money. Now, of course, there is no prison envisaged to yet. But how did we reach the prison instead? We are in the Middle Ages. Again, you have a fight, then you have a community to which they belong, who normally solve the problem when possible, but we also have law. So we have a duke, a prince, or other who often are also the legislative authority. Now, in case of any kind of fight in his kingdom, which can be a theft, a rape, or other, in order to impose the rule of law in their kingdom, they basically find a proxy. The problem is not necessarily of the victim of the offender, but it's a problem for me as the authority, as the king. So he is the prosecutor, and if you the prosecutor who represents the king or the queen, but if there is no monarchy, it's the prosecutor of let's say the political power. So you have a judge and you have some lawyers for the trial. The two, the offender and cannot really say much in a hearing. This is really a form of punitive justice. It's not a restorative justice. It's rather to repay the honor of the kingdom or of the monarchy or of the head of state. So for the last 2 centuries, there has been actually the solution is actually to deprive them of freedom. You are deprived of liberty between 1 day, 2 days, and years. But of course, you know, in the past you used mutilation. It certainly sometimes you would hang the people because there was no life imprisonment. But of course, once they serve their, you know, they have served their punishment, when they return back in society, they don't have their hand, they have lost an eye or whatever. So this is a little bit the new form of deprivation of liberty. I would say that's only been the case and the practice for the last 2.5 centuries, because in the past, as I said, punishments or prisons did not exist. Fortunately, the connection is not perfect. So you would repay your debt. And so in order, actually, you would repay your debt you had to repay your debt back, and you would not be imprisoned. As I said, imprisonment is fairly recent practice. But what is the impact? What is the consequence of this in this change in justice? Well, as you can notice in this drawing, under the red line, those who are involved, you know, the victim and the offender and the community, they no longer access the decision. The decision is taken by those who are beyond the red line, which can be the judge, the prosecutor, and or the lawyers, and they are the specialists. So normally they impose the deprivation of liberty according to the law, according to the code of law in force. But if we think about the offender and the victim, they start by identifying them, and once they've been identified, they are no longer part of the trial. And this system simply is at the end imposing a punishment, but the punishment is decided upon excluding completely the two stakeholders, so to speak, the victim and the offender. It's only done between the judge, the lawyers, and the trial is done independently of their will. Maybe even if they want to make peace and pardon each other. The trial is on. So there is an actual gap between the justice and community. And that is where actually restorative justice comes into play, which, as I have noticed here, I have designed here in this new drawing. So you have the two linked to a given family or to a given community. So you have in the lower part, the families and the mutual families and the community. So you also have the solution. So there is certainly a problem between the offender and the victim, but this problem is a problem common to the entire community. Because let's assume that last night, at night, someone has robbed the house of your neighbor in your neighborhood. So that problem, it doesn't concern only your neighbor, the neighbor and the thief. It involves the entire neighborhood, because instantly you say, oh, we are all afraid. Let's maybe add some additional security measures, because even if you have not been attacked, you feel that you are running the same risk. You start being afraid because you are living in the same neighborhood, even if that actually didn't necessarily impact you. But the community is involved. The community is aware of the problem, and it will try to find a solution. So I would say that the protagonists, the main actors, to find a solution are the victim, the offender, and the community. So in this kind of justice, they will be find help, and this is done by mediators, not by judges. These are professionals, experts, experts in law, so legal experts, who make sure that in this trial, everyone can take the floor with no insults, with full respect of mutual dignity and a right to speak, but also have a psychological formation, because they have to anticipate reactions. They're also familiar with the culture, the local culture. They know what is feasible and what is acceptable. They will also understand what can be done in community, but they are simply mediators. They are not the one who are going to provide a solution. The solution will be found between the three. Let's say there's going to be like a conciliation or a form of agreement and solution between the three. Certainly there's going to be a judge, man or woman. We don't really understand if it's a man or a woman. So it's going to be a conciliation process, and inevitably the judge will have to ratify the decision. But there is a big difference between the two, between this solution which has been found and the other, where instead the previous page, where it's actually the legal experts, the judge and so on, will decide in the name of justice. Here, in the former, let's say the stakeholders are not involved, the victim and the offender. Instead, in the second solution, they will be involved. But in the previous system, of course, inevitably, who has lost, who has been condemned, will also appeal. So whereas here in the second solution, they will have to reach a final solution, which does not provide for any kind of repeal or appeal. What I would like to underline is precisely the difference between a pure justice, where you have experts who are going to decide without involving the protagonists, all the actors and the stakeholders, and the second, where all of the stakeholders are instead involved. There is one question from Maria Luisa, who is explaining that the restorative justice is actually very difficult to be accepted by judicial authorities, because it's almost like handing over power to others. And I believe this is true for other countries. There is a form of resistance. I don't know if there is anything that we could share to somehow eliminate these forms of resistance. There are some practices which could be adopted before using restorative justice. Also, maybe that could be the way of communicating with judicial authorities. This is a problem for Latin America, but maybe not only Latin America, where it's a very strict and restrictive decision. So maybe also the age is going to, for minors, for adults, is going to pass from 18 to 16. Well, yes, there is a certain opposition or resistance to restorative justice because two are the aspects which come into play. Well, the first is power, because judges believe they're going to lose their job, and the lawyers all the more so even the prosecutor, so they will feel that they will lose their role. But this is not the case, because they will have to make sure that the procedure and the process runs legally in a correct way. So this is the first element. But the second comment would be that at least in Latin America, I believe that, I know Peru, but I believe that other Latin American countries have a similar situation. We are not actually forming legal experts, but we are forming rather lawyers. So the formation and the training is to actually, actually a lawyer is not necessarily someone who is going to be called in court. It's someone who has studied the law and understand how that could be interpreted in the case law. When I have my students, law students, I ask them something which is absolutely logic for me. I take a decision of, for example, of the higher court in Peru, read the decision and verify if it actually corresponds to justice. Most of them, and they are doing their PhD, they say, yes, it is correct because it is according to the law. So they have absolutely no idea of what actually justice is. The only thing that they are familiar with is law. They know articles by heart, but they have never questioned themselves. They have never taken the time to reflect and to see if that law is actually just, as the word says. But we don't have in restorative justice this kind of divorce, this kind of gap, because we're trying to reach a solution which can satisfy everyone. We try to put into force a code, but I think that, of course, probably it's a professional, let's say, approach of lawyers who are a bit resistant. They resist, but unfortunately we'll have to wait for a week, because next week is precisely what we're going to do. We're going to present a procedure of restorative justice. And what is the motivation that we're going to use? First of all, to convince the prosecutor, but also the public opinion and politicians and members of parliament. So maybe for more specific questions, I would like to ask you if you could just be a bit patient till next week. There's one more question. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Bruno, for your intervention, which is very clear, which allowed us to actually understand also the origin of restorative justice. These are more practices than justice, but you speak about restorative justice more than restorative practice. Shall we have to change the name and speak about restorative justice instead of restorative practice? These are practices, as I said. Is it a mistake, and do we need to change the definition? So maybe we can answer also Thomas' question. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, which is extremely interesting. My comment is the following. Bruno spoke about restorative justice. And he didn't use the word justice, he used practice. Restorative practices are institutional or institutionalized. They are inscribed in the code of law. The choice of the word practice instead of justice has been deliberate. And does this mean that we're going to have to reform justice so that this restorative practice becomes part of the restorative justice? Well, I would say the two questions are to some extent connected. I spoke about restorative practice because I wanted to, first of all, mention the origin of this practice, because, you know, justice in many countries is simply the application of law. You put law into practice. And in these specific cases, you have to maybe reflect on the idea of, there is a saying, dura lex sed lex. The law is harsh, but it is law. Can we actually agree with it? Maybe at the time, extreme law or ultimate law is ultimate injustice. So if you simply limit yourself in reading and considering the law, you basically fall into injustice. I think this could open up a very philosophical, a very broad philosophical debate on what do we mean by the word justice. Certainly, law cannot cover all of the cases. Aristotle said the law is a general framework, and inevitably, and that's what we call as justice, but then it is up to the judge who has to apply that law to different situations and circumstances. So we are no longer in the field of pure law. When I spoke about restorative practice at the beginning, this is during this first session, but then I will speak about restorative justice because, as Thomas said, we have to integrate this idea, this principle or this practice into the way that we actually practice justice. But experts and researchers attempt to question, is this actually justice or is this an alternative problem solving? Now, in the second session, I will actually make this distinction between conceptualizing a problem in form of justice, which envisages punishment. In the restorative justice, it is a problem of the community, whereas in the first kind, it refers to society. So it's not the same concept of the problem. And so also the solution, in turn, will have to probably follow a different path. Now, I would say that maybe now it is better to speak about restorative justice when you refer to judges, because otherwise one believes that it is a daily practice that you actually use with children in a family, but which has nothing to do with the justice with capital letter. It's just two different concepts and interpretations of justice, but does not correspond to the traditional interpretation of justice. I didn't really actually place that in my PowerPoint and my slides. It's a definition that I have found, which I found in the books, but which was actually found in the pharaohs, in the tombs of the pharaohs. So we are speaking about thousands of years ago. It was a judge, it was an Egyptian judge of the pharaoh. And since he basically had moved to the other earth, on his tomb, he had an epitaph saying, I was a judge, I have judged according to equity, according to justice, according to a balanced judgment. And at the end of the judgment, the two parties, the two actors have to leave the palace of justice with a light-hearted. So justice had this goal, this aim. So the offender and the victim or the defender and the defendant, the two basically should leave the room with a light-hearted, which means an agreement between the two. So there wouldn't be a loser and a winner, because otherwise the winner would try to, or the loser would try to repeal the decision and have an appeal, and this would basically escalate and lead to a spiral. But at the end of the judgment, instead, according to that age, back, as I said, to the pharaohs, the two would leave the judgment in peace, this is not, unfortunately, always the case, because often here today, the judge will say, you are right and you are wrong. It's a different way of considering justice. I prefer another form of justice where we all end up at alleviated and in peace. Bruno, your presentation and explanation is of great interesting. And I think during this course, it's important to speak about this paradigm justice, particularly I would say that most of our systems are in the fall into the category of punishing justice, particularly when you are depriving childhood. But when we speak about restorative justice, what prevails is punishment, is actually punishment and also repayment. But not everything can be achieved through a legal rational. Countries are full of laws. In Colombia, we have one of the most positive and let's say encouraging constitutions for children, but then this is theory and practice is exactly the opposite. Now, what I would like to ask concerns the challenges according to the cultural grounds on which justice is actually enacted. Because when we think about, although, as I said, there are some legal provisions, but they have been not respected because the young or the child remains labeled, remains with a stigma. We apologize, but there's a lot of noise. For us, the offender can become also a center of power. So in our society, they don't think about reinsertion of social reinsertion. So they are happier to have drug addicts, criminals and offenders because they can, police officers and the army can actually simply impose the law, can impose control. This is more of a political aspect than a cultural one. So when we think about the promotion and the advocacy of child rights, so we have to raise awareness. So we should speak about public morality and public justice. What is the role of justice in a country where the context is extremely very complex? Once again, thank you very much, because I'm very much interested in the philosophical arguments in justice. Roberto, thank you, Bruno, for your presentation. I think that the whole overview was very, very interesting because you started from the whole history of justice. But I would like to include also an additional element. When you speak about repayment, it includes restorative. But what would be interesting is to consider in the 21st century that in many countries they often are using punishment, imprisonment. So communities are disappearing and communities have no longer a voice to say. So I think that we are far more individualistic now, and it's a let's say an extreme individualism which is prevailing in our societies. So this is what is happening, and this is also due to the media. The media are somehow advocating for a hardline justice. But so I would like to ask Bruno, which are the limits which could be imposed, or the limits and the constraints of restorative justice? So the example that you have mentioned, or the in the restorative practices, they certainly could be extremely encouraging to break this vicious circle of punishment, isolating the minors with all the consequences that this kind of practice implies. Thank you very much, Bruno. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you for your questions, but I would say more than questions, these are extremely constructive comments. What you are asking is, these laws are targeting who in particular? Yes, it's the same idea. That is, you believe that justice is considered in terms of eliminating what is evil. We keep thinking that the punishing system, you have evil and good. So you have offenders, victims, and we basically are promoting this kind of polarization. But society is far more complex than what you were saying, as also Angelica was saying. This is certainly, there are lobbies. There are lobbies which are groups of power, normally controlled by those who are powerful in a way and yield power. So the idea is to absolutely eliminate, you know, and kill, exterminating. You don't have black and white. There is no black and white. There is no polarization, but rather on the opposite, we are a blend of gray. We are a blend of nuances and intermediate colors. So the restorative justice will be presented next week. It's not the silver bullet. It's not one fits all. It is not the ninth marvel in the world, but it is certainly a solution. Being aware of limits and limitations, we can try to prevent negative actions and reactions. But both in your comments, which I fully share, as also Father Foucault, laws go against human beings which cannot be reinserted into society because they are always labeled as dangerous. So this has always existed. How can we counter this paradigm? How can we counter this mindset and this form of discrimination of those who are not considered normal, or rather considered like others? But as I said, this will be presented next week. Thank you, Bruno. I have 4 questions, and I will limit myself to 2 because maybe the third might be presented during the following presentation. What I would like to say is that justice could be restorative justice is not only for the offender, because it gives the opportunity to the offender or to the culprit to feel a bit relieved because he might be pardoned by community. So I just wonder if this is not another form of injustice towards the victim, because the victim will find himself exposed. And then the second comment is the offender might be self-inflicting a punishment, because when he goes into prison, So when he has served, he leaves maybe 5 years later, but he remains labeled. So in using restorative justice, he might decide to instead repay in money the victim, so compensate. And maybe does the victim have the right of issuing a decision, or rather if the decision of the legal authority it does not correspond to the actual let's say to the actual act, can he revert this decision? There was a question also on financial means, the risk. I think there are a number of questions which is certainly going to be clarified in the second session, during which I will try to underline the roles of the three, of the community, of the offender, and of the victim, because individually they all play a role, and I don't think there's going to be a double punishment, I would say, because probably we would certainly start with restorative justice, and then this would involve two systems which are somehow contradictory. I don't know, can I move on to the second session so that I can maybe clarify questions also, and we could do that maybe at the end, because we're speaking about the role of the victim, of the offender, and the self-inflicting punishment. So these, once again, the fundamentals of restorative justice. Maybe the word fundamentals might be a bit exaggerated, but the idea is to compare the various justice models. We're going to compare two justice models. We're going to compare the, let's say, the restorative or restoration or retribution, as it is here indicated. However, what I would like to mention here, what I would like to explain is actually the underlying logic, or rather than logic, the underlying philosophy. Probably you have always noticed the classical system, which is the punishing and system, and the other is the restorative justice. I think one question has already been mentioned, that is, who are the actors, who are the main actors and stakeholders? On the left-hand side, for justice, you have the judge, the prosecutor, and the lawyers, and on the right-hand side, the well-known actors with the little drawings. What I would like to underline in this slide is that on the left-hand side, you have the professionals, the experts, because they all have their diploma. They all have their degree because they probably have studied law, and they don't have a degree in law, or so they have specialized. But once you have completed your studies, probably we have the idea, or the we are tempted to look at the other by saying, I have studied and you know, so you haven't. So when looking at the victim. So on the right-hand side, you have the protagonists, the offender, the victim, and the community, each one with his family, clan, or village, or other. And then you have the mediator. The mediator are of paramount importance, because the question is, one could say the victim, it can be, one of the questions was, the victim can be suffering a double crime and a double deed, and all the attention is on the offender to reinsert. No, because the victim has a role to play, and it is a role which is denied in the punishment. So we never have a victim in the retribution system, because they never ask the victim, what did you feel? Because it's never the victim who's going to decide, but it is the code of law. We're saying that for example, the punishment is between 3 and 5 years. And this is regardless of the opinion of the victim. The victim is not even heard. So it's not absolutely the primary concern of the legal system. We have two systems, the system of the specialist, and then you have the actors. What is the procedure which is normally followed? On the left-hand side, you have a situation of the so-called retribution justice. You first of all do fact-finding, fact analysis, and once the facts have been confirmed and they are evidence, they verify in the code. If it is a criminal code or a civil code. So in the criminal code, if it covers those facts, and if it is considered and defined as an offense, otherwise justice is not involved, because it doesn't refer to justice. So there are many facts which do create problems, but they're not envisaged by law. So the judge can say, this is not my problem, which is also somehow giving a bit of a legal framework. But this doesn't necessarily solve the problem in society. So once it has been identified, one also can understand which is the kind of punishment, which can be life imprisonment, which can be a number of years of imprisonment. So in the light of the crime, the decision can probably assign the number of years in prison. Now, in restorative justice starts from the facts. So it's the same facts which are being analyzed, but there is a complete change of paradigm, because the facts are not going to be classed according to a given type, because that fact has provoked problems. It has broken the relationship in a society, which can be a rape, a theft, or other. Now, even if the reference is not the criminal code, but it is rather community. So one will actually ask, and this is never considered in the retribution system, which is the cause. So what is it the origin of those facts? Because sometimes in the legal system, one uses other elements to reduce the punishment. But instead, in the restorative, they use also the origin. Let's say that there is someone, a young minor, who enters into my house and steals my running shoes. For the criminal code, so it's a type, which type? Theft. What is the punishment? There is a given punishment. Now, in the restorative justice, no, because which is the cause? Why did he steal those running shoes or those shoes? Because he wanted to buy drug with them, he wanted to, or because he wanted to use them and maybe simply charm his girlfriend on the weekend party, or simply because he's hungry and he wanted to sell them to buy food? Or did he steal my shoes, running shoes, because he had to buy maybe some drugs for his younger brother and he didn't have money? So it's there is a whole variety of causes which completely changes the approach. If it is to buy drugs, to buy food, to buy to impress his girlfriend or boyfriend, or to buy drugs. So it's completely different. Now, in restorative justice, there is also an attention to the causes of that given fact, because that will certainly influence the decision. If he has stolen the running shoes to buy drug, then the solution will have to include a system or a program of detoxification. So to be basically, eliminate the drug dependency. If instead he has stolen them because he wants to impress his girlfriend, he might need to have some sessions with the psychologist. If instead he did that to buy drugs or food, one will have to analyze his situation. Why doesn't he have food enough? Why doesn't he have drugs? So it might be more of a social problem. So the solution will be tailored and will vary according to the analysis of the causes, but not only the causes limited to the offender, but also the consequences of his mischief, because in a retribution justice, the causes are irrelevant. There has been a theft, while in a restorative justice, instead the causes become important because that will influence the solution chosen. If we remain in my example, the boy who has stolen my running shoes in my house, I'm not really concerned because I don't really use them. I'm not a sports person. My shoes are fairly new. My actual problem, the consequences of my problem is that I didn't really lose my running shoes. I don't really use them. However, I am annoyed by the fact that he has entered into my house. So he has violated my house. So I would be afraid in the future to leave my home. I will buy a second lock and I will try to improve security of my home. So what concerns me is actually the breaking into my house. So maybe the question is, why did he steal in my house and not in my neighbor's? The shoes are no longer my problem. I'm not my main, let's say, concern. But if instead he has stole the shoes of a sports or of an athlete who will not be able to run his competition because he might lose some points in his competition, and maybe the sponsor will not reimburse him. In that case, the theft of shoes becomes a question of money, of future, of career as a sports person. So you can see the consequences, once again, vary a lot and influence and have an impact on the solutions. So they have nothing to do in the restorative justice, they become fundamental, but instead in the retribution one, not. So the circumstances vary, and in restorative justice, one tries to understand the circumstances and the causes and the consequences. So the victim will have the possibility of underlying in which way this fact has impacted in his life. For example, in Mexico, there are some laws who provide the victim with a right of information, which normally is not envisaged by retribution justice. So he will have a right to ask for an explanation and a justification. He can ask, why did you steal? Why did you follow me? Why? What is the reason? So elements which are not important in retribution justice, but which instead become important in restorative justice. So I would say the facts are the same, but the way that they are analyzed varies between the two. So it will be influenced by the causes. So what are the conclusions? Well, we first of all try to identify the fault, culpability. So the guilt and the will somehow influence the punishment. So we have to identify. So we will inevitably have to condemn. We will say, this is what you have done. You're bad. You have done something which is unacceptable according to our law in our society. And so your punishment, the punishment will be repaying your debt through a number of years in prison or other forms of punishment. And this is what has been done in retributive justice. But in restorative justice, first of all, we try to analyze the responsibility. And the responsibility is not necessarily limited to the offender. If we take, for instance, the guy who has stolen the shoes, the running shoes or the sports shoes, because he didn't have food for his younger child, why isn't the community working? Why is a child alone and he doesn't have enough food or money for the drugs? But if instead it's only to buy drugs and everyone knows that he's a drug addict, why didn't the community take on its responsibility and intervene and act? So the responsibility can be on the side of the victim as well. So the three can be held responsible. They don't find necessarily who is guilty, but it is more identifying the responsibility, because it's through responsibility that one will be able to identify the reparation. Now, if it's a theft, reparation means you have to return the object stolen. No, the offender doesn't necessarily self-inflict a punishment, but at least in certain cases, in cases of a murder, no, there is no form of reparation, because unfortunately it's impossible. However, there is a way of repairing. It can be personal, symbolic, or other, but there is also, maybe we will have to guarantee reinsertion. That is, in a retributive justice, you have paid your debt, you leave the prison, and you have now a record, a criminal record, and you will not be hired, your family will no longer accept you, the same with your friends. In the restorative justice, instead, there's going to be a reinsertion, not only of the offender, because everyone, the community, will be able to say he has offended, he has it has been a mischief, but he has repaired, so he is reinserted into society. But also the victim, because the victim too is labeled and has stigmatized, because the victim can say, this is exactly what happened. He has been stolen, he has been raped, or else. So how can the victim too be reinserted in society, so that she or he may no longer be a victim, but rather become a fully active and an active player in society? So I would say that reinsertion is symbolic. Now, I would like to continue because I see that we're running short with time. Justice retributive always looks at the past, it would be the yellow arrow or orange arrow. So the past, from that given date, what happened looking back, but they only limit the analysis to the past, while in the restorative, they also consider the future. We all know what happened, but how are we going to start again? We are going to have a look at the future as well. How are we going to be able to reconstruct a future where social relationships will be repaired? So the vision of time varies completely. We no longer look at the past. What was the past is the past, but we're going to use the past to build a future. So maybe we'll try to find a way in the future. So we try to rebuild also the future, and trying to respond to the causes and analyzes the causes. Poverty, lack of, I need to now sort of come to a conclusion. There is also a great difference in recognizing, first of all, in the retributive, they try to understand. Often that's what the client asks the lawyer. You're familiar with my file. You are familiar with my details. You can use them against the other. So the judge also has to be informed. but it's completely different compared to the restorative one, justice, because in restorative we know that, but in knowing we also limit because it is a limiting. So, for example, the offender is simply a thief. He is considered a thief, full stop. So the causes, the consequences are not necessarily important. In restorative, instead, we try to acknowledge, and as mentioned, and as the psychologist as well, this is not only a question of rational, but it's also a question of instinct. And when you do that, when you have an instinctive reaction, there is also a form of compassion. You recognize and you acknowledge, but you also feel compassion. So you recognize the feelings of the victim and of the offender. This young guy who has basically done that because he wanted to buy food or other. I simply limit myself to the thief, and he's for me simply a thief. No, I acknowledge his dignity and his personality. Not only he has stolen, but he's also in solidarity with his younger brother. It's someone who goes to school and is someone who's playing football in the parish or other. So someone who maybe is at school or other. I'm trying to recognize the person and not limit myself to the facts. And this is a fundamental and dramatic difference, because you take into account the person and not the facts and not the acts. So the person as a whole, not only the person that is the offender, but also the victim. The victim, if the victim of the theft is an 80-year-old elderly woman who lives alone, or the mother in a family. So when you say recognize, we have to identify a solution which can actually respond to the deepest causes and the consequences that that kind of theft has provoked. So there are some rules and regulations. I would like to simply mention the Tokyo conclusions, and this is not to deprive of liberty, and it is actually the goal of our meeting. There is paragraph 8, which tells us that the judicial authority should take into account in making its decision rehabilitative needs of the offender, the protection of society, and the interests of the victim, who should be consulted whenever appropriate. So this is Article 8.1 of the Tokyo document. So we have, it's not punishment, but rather reinsertion of the offender, because as we said, punishment in itself doesn't really lead to anything. It has to have a goal, an aim, but if it's simply to revenge, we simply add an additional problem. We have to inevitably consider also the problem of the offender. Maybe we also should consider the reasons why, you know, the motivation for that kind of act. Or something would say simplistic, oh, he was unlucky, he was born in a poor family. No, we have to also act from a social point of view, because we have to make sure that this problem does not reoccur, because if you do not do anything, the situation will remain the same. Once he leaves the prison, the situation will, he will start again. But we also have to think about the interests of the victim, not only a problem of the offender and of the victim, but in society. What does society, what does the public opinion believe? When you speak about retributive justice, you normally talk to the victim, and normally the first thing the victim says, nobody heard, nobody has taken into account what I had to say, and so normally the victim justifies and asks to be listened, asks to be understood. So the victim normally is not simply to say, you know, send him into prison. He wants to understand why. He wants to be understood. So you have to give him the floor to allow him to express what he feels. And then Also, what is the possible solution that one could propose? The victim could even say, now, if it were my case, I was stolen in my house, I have to improve security measures. I want to feel reassured. I want to feel safe at home. So maybe even you should have a little psychological support just to feel reassured. And maybe, okay, yes, returning the shoes, sorry, could be a part of the solution, but it's not the main part of the problem. Maybe we would need a professional who can act. So the victim also has interests which are not necessarily covered by the criminal code, you know, like returning the object and other solutions. So you have to take into account also the victim's position. Now, what is the actual important comparison? It is between the two retributive and restorative. The final sum is zero. What one earns, the other loses. If there is a fine, one pays and the other loses. So you remain on the same level, but the total sum is zero. A win-win solution, let's say. Now, in restorative justice, instead, the sum is positive. It's, as I said, it's a win-win. The offender, because the offender can be reinserted and also can repair his guilt or his crime. The victim, because the victim has been listened and his needs or her needs were met, and the community, because the community can restore the relationship and the bonds. Now, there will always have a scar. We cannot deny that something occurred, but it's simply a scar and not, you know, like a gap or a fracture. There is no, you know, plague. There is no wound, or rather than a sore, an open sore. It's not an open open sore, an open wound, but there is a scar now. But the scar shows that something occurred, but there has been also a remedy, trying to limit the consequences and avoiding particularly that the wound has been closed. So you also have limited damages. Of course, normally the three protagonists, the three players, all win when they find they adopt this kind of solution. Final word on restorative justice. There are three possible levels which can be combined. So reparation to the victim. So if you break my tooth, I have to go to the dentist and have it repaired. Then you can have symbolic reparation. For example, the offender is someone who is driving his car after a party. He is drunk and he runs over a person. So you have to, first of all, repay the victim, hoping the victim is in fairly good health. You'll have to pay for the medical expenses, the surgery, or whatever. But then there is also a problem with society, with the community. So we'll have to say, to the driver who was drunk, you know, now in addition to repairing the victim, you're going to repair the community. So you are going to avoid this occurring again. It's not only a question of paying compensation monies, but you will work at the hospital for 5 weekends so that you can actually understand what are the consequences produced by drunken drivers, and you're going to help at first aid, and you will actually assist and see the damage that you produce, not only the fractures and the wounds, but the families, the stress, the concern, and the traumas. So it's a symbolic form of compensation with the society. And so the offender will be aware of his or her responsibility, and that solution will be certainly more effective. There is also a reparation for the offender. when we speak about young in conflict with law, one could tell that young, part of your reparation or part of the solution is that you're going to return to school because you drop out. You left school for 4 months, you're going to go back to school, and this is part of your reparation. We are going to help you, of course, because if you dropped out from school, is that because maybe school doesn't meet your needs or your skills? We're going to try to find a school which is willing to accept you, or maybe which can imply a change. If he has problems, you know, drug, you're going to go to a clinic, or maybe simply go through you know, a rehab or a withdrawal cure or a detox center. So also the third image includes acts on the offender. But it won't be limited only to the act. You're a thief, we're going to cut your hand. But basically ask you, why are you stealing? Because why don't you go to school? You're a drug addict, you have personality problems. So we're going to try to find a solution. So I would say this could be a combination of repairing, giving a reparation to the victim and to community and to the offender. Now, we have to a bit see which is the balance. So basically, where is the balance? What is more heavy, so to speak, uneven, or what is the advantage for the society? I think that you can play with these components, with these factors to understand which is the system that you privilege. I think next week I will try to see how can we actually apply this kind of restorative justice, which does already exist in some of our societies, but which inevitably shows limits. And so if you do have questions and comments, I would ask you humbly to maybe postpone them, maybe write them down so you don't forget them, but maybe we can take them next week. And now, of course, I'm willing to try to, you know, answer to any other comment. And thank you very much for your patience above all. Probably these are more comments than questions on what is happening in the countries. They're not really questions. I also noticed that there is one comment. Sometimes the law does not envisage any kind of limit, doesn't consider reparation, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a judge who decides exactly. In Mali, the community leaders do also have a role in the field of justice. So my question refers to reparation. Now, precariousness is not considered, taken into account, because maybe if you're living in precarious or vulnerable conditions, that might provoke, you know, violence, aggression. And once the process is triggered, so during the various reparation phases or stages, the offender should also foresee a material compensation. But normally the basis of all this is precarious conditions.
Podríamos estar hablando, me hiciste acordar de el libro de Adela Cortina sobre aporofobia.
Aporophobia. It's a book that I read, which is fairly in line with what you were saying about the stigma of the poor, the decisions that they also take when they commit crimes, which doesn't mean that we justify those crimes, but sometimes
podríamos entonces hablar de
we could maybe speak about restorative justice.
Es decir, no se puede mirar desde una sola línea,
That might imply maybe a combination of different parts. I would say that the two questions go a bit in the same direction. However, I take Thomas first. Precarious conditions certainly come into play in defining reparation, but also in the judicial procedure. I believe that poverty doesn't lead necessarily to crime. It's not because you're poor, automatically you are a potential offender or criminal. Like look at our politicians and ministers who are highly corrupted. They're not corrupted because they are poor. They are corrupted, period. So poverty can certainly limit the growth and development of a person. So in a legal system, in a system of justice, how can we access reparation? Now, poverty somehow points at the key element. So if there is poverty, it's because the community is not properly organized or the society is not properly well organized. So that's justice and wealth. You know, in many countries, and my countries, but I believe in your countries, often, and this was one of the first questions in the chat, in justice is limit to the rich people. If you have a good lawyer, you will be acquitted. And if you have a simple lawyer, you're going to lose. So this also, with our retributive justice, there's something which is not working properly. It's a system which in itself is unequal and unjust. Now, in the case of restorative justice, I believe that what Thomas has said, what is the limit? So if I have to actually repay what I have stolen, let's not speak, we're not speaking about great amounts, but we're speaking about small amounts, because simply maybe I was hungry, I cannot return that money. So this kind of justice will say, if you don't have money, you will go to prison. So I would say that this kind of justice has the possibility of providing an alternative. You can repay because you have already had your meal, but you even can do some symbolic gestures to the community, which will allow you to repay your debt, so to speak, but you're also going to be reinserted in community. And there, I think it does provide a great advantage, especially for the poorest. It's not a question of money, but it's more a question of being aware of this form of reinsertion. And in the field of this kind of justice, there is no actual feeling and no actual possibility, because it's more of a punition. You want to be punished because it's more of a revenge. While in this kind of restorative justice, you can repay even if you're not actually, you don't have the means of what you have stolen, or you have maybe murdered, or you have killed. Of course, in that case, there's no form of repaying. But even when it is impossible to repay, there is an alternative. There's always an alternative. And I'm not thinking about only crimes. I'm also referring to a social system. There are situations in which reparation is to be privileged compared. I'm thinking about what happened in Rwanda. I'm thinking at I'm thinking about Southern Africa. I'm thinking about the transitional justice in Colombia. There are given situations where putting into prison more than half of the population is certainly not the solution. So restorative justice does provide alternative solutions, which are difficult, yes, but which take time also, of course, which are not compulsory. And we will certainly see now if it is a deliberate gesture, but which certainly can be more long-lasting, rather than sending them to life imprisonment. Or also for poverty. Poverty cannot justify. I think that the Politicians and ministers are certainly not necessarily encouraged in trying to redress an unjust society. So when we speak about justice, we certainly have to take into account the overall picture. We have to analyze the consequences and not only the causes, and not limit your judgment to the fact. You have raped, you have killed, you have murdered, you have stolen. You have to also see which are the circumstances. And this is why I am convinced that justice, restorative justice, is actually a more adequate response and certainly less harmful, both for the victim as well as for the offender. Now, next week, we are going to analyze the motivations in better understanding how can we actually have a restorative justice. Now, there were other questions as well. Poverty, I think, poverty. And maybe also that justice, because you have to actually pay for a lawyer. They're not all necessarily fit for the job. I think that maybe going to prison is certainly a very negative, has very negative consequences, actually. So how can you reinsert children or these minors once they come out of prison? Are there psychologists or people who can accompany them during reinsertion for them, the victim, the child or the offender and the family? Yes, well, the idea is that they should not go to prison at all. The idea would be to find a completely different solution. Because if you remember article, the one I mentioned at the beginning, once they are in prison and once they are part of a punishment, it's very difficult to come out. And that's not a solution to the problem, particularly when we speak about abuses. It was a very traumatic experience. I went to Cameroon and with the members of Congress, we have visited Douala. Now, there was one field where there were rather 2 or 3 prisoners who were drinking their tea with, around their table. And they said, who are they? Oh, they are former ministers accused of, found guilty of corruption. But there was another one where there was a big pavilion with a grid, and behind there were a lot of people. This was named Kosovo. Do you remember Kosovo, no? Inside you had hundreds. I don't know if they had been judged, but the only thing was to open up. They could actually, they opened once per day, and they would put, like big containers of food and water, and there was no control. They even didn't know how many people were there. So it was pure hell. When we spoke with the director and we said, but this Kosovo pavilion is really not ideal. And he said, yes, of course, but it's not my problem. Prison is not, we didn't invent that. You Europeans have imported it in our countries. So our system, you changed the system and you have imposed that, depriving liberty. So we do our best, but it's not our system. So this is why I think that if we can somehow go back to the values, to the ways of traditional problem solving, is certainly much better than installing a system which is impossible to be managed because there are no resources. And this is true for young and for adults. When you put them behind the bars in prison, is basically cutting and breaking all bonds and relationships with their families, with their peers, and it becomes almost impossible to reinsert them because they remain with the stigma. They have been stigmatized because they had problems with justice, and everyone knows that. So reinsertion doesn't start after, but it's part of the solution and of the measures to be taken. Which of course needs an assessment, a proper assessment to understand if the young can remain in his community. I know that in Africa it might not be easy, but you cannot send him to a prison. Maybe he could be inserted in another community where he doesn't have the same bonds. So it should be decided on a case-by-case basis, but you cannot send them to a prison which is certainly not conceived for young people, for minors, and for reinsertion. So you have to actually tackle the causes of the problem. I know my answer is a very general answer and also maybe a bit idealistic. Maybe one should analyze case by case, but in the light of the experiences, especially with the members of BITE in Africa, there is part of the solution is actually to reinsert the child, maybe speaking to the family. If the family condemns, there's nothing we can do. So we inevitably will have to also work with the family because we have to convince the family that the child has given potential, that he has certain qualities. It's a long-term action rather than simply sending him into prison, which is easy to be done, but it's not easy when he leaves the prison to be reinserted. But this has to be taken into account when deciding the procedure. Maria Emilia? So first of all, thank you very much, because this presentation was absolutely very enriching. And Bruno, you must not justify yourself and excuse yourself when you say that restorative justice is probably still utopian, but we hope that we might be able to impose. I'm thinking about an experience in 2002. We were able to visit the Center of Rehabilitation in Milan, and they had a bit of this approach. The children or the minors who were arriving, there was a team, which was a team, a doctor, a psychologist, a social worker, and they were doing a bit of an assessment, first of all, and they were also sharing with the judge how much time the child should remain. And it was not based as what happens in Peru and maybe another country on the amount of the damage. So normally the prison years are in line with the, let's say, the damage. But you have some thieves who know that there is like a ceiling and they steal just under the ceiling and they remain free. And that's not only for thieves, but also for pedophiles and others. So they do a psychological assessment, which would be an integral assessment, taking into account also the social events and social factors. And the minor would remain until he was rehabilitated. So if he had stolen something expensive, but he was healthy, and that he was stealing because he needed to give money to her mother, who had to go to a hospital and because only 5% was local, all the others were migrants. So there was another who had stolen simply using something of a very limited value, but because he basically needed more time in rehabilitation. So the punishment could be increased or decreased, but there was like a holistic assessment. And I found that was a great change. And they had maybe some, you know, rooms where they could listen to music, they could do crafts and arts and crafts formation courses. And when they basically could leave the center, only when the social worker had make sure that he had found a job, even if it was a temporary job, and the social worker during 2 years accompanied and monitored this minor. So it was more of a systematic approach, the entire person as a package, and also trying to take care to make sure that he would be reintegrated into the society with no stigma. I really have no information on how they would behave, but I simply wanted to share with you this experience to this very rich presentation. Thank you very much. Just a first-hand comment. Maybe, yes, the idea of restorative justice is to try to act in the light of the causes. So when you steal something, as you were saying, the value in itself is not really very important. What is important are the consequences. So what kind of consequence does that have for the victim? So you have to work with the victim, and not only with the law, but also with the victim. So with the overall, I would say, with all of the aspects. And now I think it is very fashionable in Peru at the prosecutor's office. When there is there is a multidisciplinary approach and audit. But then there is a new policy is to maybe have a tailor-made treatment. And now I wonder, if you have 600 young, how can you do that if you don't have specialists, social workers, psychologists, and other? I think it's really, it's a slogan, but that doesn't really have an impact. Now, as regards the systemic contributions, one comparison: if someone is ill and if he attends you know, medical cabinet, and the doctor simply says, oh, you have, okay, tuberculosis. I'm going to give you the medicine that you need, the drug, and that's all. That's all. So, of course, the patient will never overcome the illness, because you have to think about also maybe if he's eating properly, it might be because he's living in a place where it's extremely humid, or maybe because he is stressed for his work. So if he doesn't really see the whole of that, and he tries to answer to the whole of ideology, he will never be treated. He will never solve. So those who have actually created a problem, if we simply limit ourselves to the fact that occurred and we don't necessarily see the circumstances, we will never be able to provide an appropriate reply. So it's not to justify what has been done. No, that's not the question, but rather to actually make our measures effective. So if we don't change anything, if we don't necessarily now consider, you know, the his reactions, his psychological problems, and others, we are simply giving a, you know, a pill and not looking at the whole. I think that we need to provide a systemic reply, which is also part of the law. I think that it's part of the law. We have to consider that as well.
Soy Blanca Fuentes de Guatemala.
I am Blanca Fuente from Guatemala. I think that what is fundamental and also what is interesting is the restorative justice. I think that the problem that is, common to young who are in conflict with the law. But I think that in our communities, where the situation becomes far more complex in terms of reinsertion when you have mafias exploiting teenagers and minors. We call them maras or gangs. So if you go with one of these gangs, if someone wants to leave the gang, it's impossible. He remains a prisoner. So there are some situations that we'll have to understand how can we actually help, because those gangs are there waiting for them, even when they leave, just to maybe mention that, because there are some situations which are a bit complex, which are not easy to, to be solved. I must say that I don't really have an answer. I can understand that the situation in Central America is, I know it's complex, but it's also a question of community, because the same community is partially involved. There are others who say that drug traffickers are exploiting the children. So these problems do actually invite us to reconsider society, and that what Roberto was saying, maybe a firm hand doesn't really solve the problem. But the problem of maras, also called gangs, is actually a problem. Not only a problem of justice, but also corruption, society. Especially in Latin America and many countries, we have the same kind of stress and pressure. Also in Mexico, for example, with the gangs or guerrillas in certain countries. I must admit that I don't really have a solution to that. Thank you for highlighting the problem, but maybe we will have to see in the future. I don't have a reply to this question, unfortunately. So thank you very much. What we can say is that next week we have Bruno. So this will allow us to further analyze restorative justice. Thank you very much, Bruno. So since we're going to speak about the system of restorative justice, it would be interesting if in each of you in your countries could understand which are the limits that you would be imposing to each other from a legal point of view, and also on the other, the motivations, the positive aspects of a restorative justice, just to make concrete all of this. Or is it impossible to consider this kind of restorative justice? Is it impossible for a legal reason, for a cultural reason, for the mindset? That might maybe enrich our conversation. So thank you so much for your will to listen